Hello, my name is Matthew Gates, and my presentation today will be over the title Tracing Changes in Jazz Perception from 1937 to 1956 through Duke Ellington's Crescendo and Diminuendo in Blue. To begin with, I'd like to clarify the term jazz perception. By jazz perception, I'm referring to the collective attitudes, beliefs, understandings, and emotional responses that laymen held towards jazz music. Additionally, this term will also refer to the awareness of the existence of jazz as a music or an art form. So my rationale for picking this topic. Much of this class has been focused on Duke Ellington, his music, how he perceived his own music relative to jazz, and his desire to elevate Black music to the level of classical music while retaining its unique improvisational spirit. However, I think it is equally important to explore the parallel developments of jazz, the shifts in the perception of jazz, and the proliferation of jazz styles that in some cases hindered Ellington's efforts and in other cases aided Ellington in his efforts to elevate Black music. Toward that end, I have decided to use Ellington's Crescendo and Diminuendo in Blue as a lens to trace these developments within jazz. I will mainly be focusing on the creation of the piece in 1937, its initial reception, shifts in jazz perception through the subsequent decades, and ending with the piece's resurgence at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1956. So regarding the reception of the piece, Crescendo and Diminuendo in Blue in 1937, we're at the point where Ellington wrote this piece and the jazz world was squarely in the swing era craze, a period dominated by dance bands, hit records, and clear, danceable song forms. Historical records generally note that there were three basic reactions to this early version of the piece. The first group or reaction was from the faithful Ellington fans that appreciated variety in Ellington's sets and appreciated the break from the somewhat monotonous dance numbers. The second group was generally described as the broader dancing crowd, which seemed to enjoy the climactic build of the crescendo part of the piece, but were not as receptive to the more reflective diminuendo portion of the piece. The last group are the musicians, who generally recognized the sophistication that Ellington was using, the precise way that the music was written and performed, and the structural developments that Ellington was employing within the piece. For Ellington, this was an example of his early compositional skills, his innovating the big band style, and his continuous attempts to explore more extended forms. Listening to this piece, we hear a clear use of Ellington's layered horn voicings, call and response between different horn sections, and liberal use of structured improvisation. Sadly, this piece was not received as a mass favorite, but was well received enough to become a respected staple in Ellington's library. We'll discuss quickly the reception of Crescendo and Diminuendo in Blue at the 1956 Newport Jazz Festival. The legendary performance at the Newport Jazz Festival is one of constant reference in the jazz community. As history notes, by the end of the first few choruses of Paul Gonsalves's solo, the crowd was cheering, dancing, and to quote George Avakian, the crowd had become an enormous single living organism. Musicians like saxophonist Paul Desmond and the record producer George Avakian hailed this piece's performance as a highlight of the entire festival. It's at this point that I ask myself what could have been the difference in reception between the 1930s audience perception of the piece and the mid 1950s reception of the piece at the Newport Jazz Festival? What could have changed in the public jazz perception to warrant such a shift in reception between these two periods? I'll use the remainder of my presentation time to reflect on what I think aided in the cultural and perceptual shift in jazz between these two performances. In exploring the contributing factors that fostered such a shift in perception, I think it's important to explore some of the parallel factors in history of the 20th century that assisted in creating an audience for Ellington during his career. Also, events that challenged swing musicians to evolve as things were evolving, and the world events that fostered new styles within jazz, which further aided in the creating a sense of legitimacy in jazz. So I think one huge factor to Ellington's success and the shifting of jazz's perception lies in the Great Migration of the 20th century. Well, there are two of them, but the Great Migration is just as a singular concept, the Harlem Renaissance, and the rise of the black middle class. So by the 1930s, the Great Migration relocated many black Americans all across the United States, and especially in northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. In these new cities, black Americans often found higher paying industrial jobs, and as a result had more disposable income for anything in general. This, coupled with the urban enclaves occurring during the Harlem Renaissance, began to create a higher earning professional middle class that was creating a culturally rich community capable of providing black patronage. We see examples of this through the increase of record sales and opportunities for touring acts like Duke Ellington's orchestra and other touring orchestras that now had a touring circuit to visit some of these dance halls, performance halls, etc. As Ellington's name became more widespread, he was able to branch out farther and perform for more audiences outside of New York. This is, for example, why we have the famous Fargo recordings of Duke Ellington, because we're talking about black enclaves, we're talking about blacks migrating to such far-reaching parts as Fargo that they could bring in touring acts like Duke Ellington and other black orchestras. The next factor that I think deserves a little bit of credence here is essentially the jumping the racial divide, the exportation of black culture, and the creation of a young white jazz audience. While jazz was highly supported within the black community, it was largely unknown to others and outsiders until it found a wider audience. One monumental event that catapulted jazz into the mainstream was the Benny Goodman performance at the Palomar Theater in California on August 21st, 1935. Goodman's performance of this new syncopated swing music sparked a nationwide craze amongst white teenagers and young white adults, and as a result, jazz was more embraced as a dance music, radio play of jazz soared, and record sales skyrocketed. Another factor that aided in the perceptual shift of jazz was jazz being introduced to a nationwide audience through Hollywood film. While records were limited in how long a band could perform due to the limitations of the technology, film did not have such a limitation. As a result, jazz found even more of a growing audience through the medium of film. The next factor which I think deserves some attention, is the proliferation of jazz styles in the post-World War II jazz era. Though it created many challenges for Duke Ellington and other jazz musicians, World War II forced a transformation in jazz that widened what listeners would perceive as jazz or what jazz could be. Due to the rationing policy during World War II, for example, many bands were unable to continue their typical touring schedule and were forced to downsize or risk going under. Additionally, the introduction of the cabaret tax at live performance events made it virtually impossible for large touring bands to continue to survive financially. The cabaret tax essentially taxed venues and sometimes bands if there was any dancing while the music was being played. As a result, many musicians began to pare down into smaller groups and we began to see new innovative styles like bebop, cool jazz, and hard bop emerging as a result of this challenge to a musician's touring ability. With each of these new styles, jazz was being expanded in the public consciousness on what it could sound like and what it could encompass. And bringing it back to the Newport Jazz performance of Crescendo and Diminuendo in Blue, by the time Ellington performed this piece at the Newport Jazz Festival, the entire perception of jazz had shifted multiple times and now had a much more wide-reaching audience. Jazz had cultivated enough of an audience through audience creation, through such examples as the Benny Goodman performance, bringing in a larger white audience. And I believe the lukewarm reception to Crescendo and Diminuendo in Blue was now substituted with this over-the-top appreciation and understanding. The audience were now receptive to a more improvisatory, longer form experience, and I believe factors like that explain a large amount of why the experience of this piece 2 decades removed was so opposite and different in this fashion. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Have a great day.